Good morning, good afternoon.
Good
Can you hear
afternoon.
me?
Morning for you, yes.
Yeah, it's early-ish, but it's not that early. How are you doing?
Good, thanks.
Great to see you. I'm going to set you up to co-host. Let me see.
And I see you've got a live audience there for a change.
Yeah, we do have a live audience. We're all here, and let's see. Let me more. I go here and I go make co-host. Um, I was just giving the mini introduction to you, Bronwyn, but essentially, the reason that I find it so interesting to bring you, I've had Bronwyn come and speak to my class many different times. I teach a course in analyzing trends, and Bronwyn's background, your background, Bronwyn, is so interesting because you're somebody who has incredible depth in studying trends. You're out there reporting, analyzing all this information, but your background before that is this interesting combination of microeconomics, foresight. Is there anything else I'm missing there too? There was another
And
part.
marketing. I did a bit of theology too. So I think my educational credentials sort of spread across that. So I started with theology, then did marketing and business management, then economics, then future studies, which kind of tied it all together, right?
What was the shift to future studies? What was it that the itch that had you move in that direction?
Well, that was actually because I was working for an American organization, which you might be familiar with. They've called the Agora Group. And what they do is my role was marketing and publishing, editing, and distributing their insights on political and economic analysis for the retail investor market. So they would give macro perspectives and micro perspectives on where the future was headed, and then they'd give investment cases to go along with it. That was their business model. And essentially they were engaging in future studies without explicitly saying it as such, right? They were making bets on where the future was going to be going. And I was selling their ideas for so long. I thought I had a few ideas that might be just as good as what they had. And sooner or later you want to create the product, not just sell it. So that was sort of tying together both my economics and marketing background. It made sense.
Well, it's an area of, that's the thing for us all to be honest about, is that, there have been people who have been doing something called foresight and whatever, but the way in which it's kind of the work that you're doing now and the way that that particular area is developing is relatively new. It's sort of like it, in terms of it's more people are interested in it. I would say it's integrating more than it did in the past. It used to be much siloed into government and other kinds of things, but yes.
Yeah, I think it was post government that started looking at foresight. Governments have done this for a very long time. China's sort of 50 years, 500 years plans are nothing new. These are things that empires that have always done and that estate planning has done from a sort of monarchy perspective too. So it's always come naturally to the state to want to sort of look further ahead. But corporates are starting to look in that direction. I think one of the fastest trending C-suite positions at the moment is Chief Foresight Officer. So the sort of commercialization of the foresight space, because it moved from politics to the world of arts. There's a lot of people that have come out of advertising and arts and strategic design and design thinking that got interested in this sort of sphere. But there weren't many people, or really any people, that I knew when I got into it from a sort of business commercial perspective, because they're sort of, foresight stopped at forecasting, which was clearly limiting. The first thing they tell you when you study economics or financial planning is past performance is no guarantee of future returns. And then you go and plug past performance into your future looking models. And I thought that's a bit of a giant flaw right there. So it's been interesting to see that both for better and for worse, the commercialization of this space, because it can become quite cynical. But then again, it was quite cynical from a sort of Machiavellian state-orientated perspective too, wasn't it, right? It was all about winning and strategy. So, is it that surprising? Not at all. And I think as human lifespans get longer, we've got a little bit more luxury of time to look ahead. Of course, shareholders are also planning on living a bit longer. So shouldn't come as a great surprise if you follow the incentives.
I wanted you to just sort of touch again upon, because it's a nuanced issue for people who may be a little new to this topic, is what is the difference between forecasting and foresight?
Should I just share the slides? You asked me to
you're going to do,
right into that.
Okay, I don't know how much. I wanted to do a little intro in case that wasn't in there, but because you touched upon it, but you go right ahead. It's I have you as co-host. It should go up.
Yeah.
right
Sure.
away.
So let me share it and we'll see how far we get. So this can probably take around 20-ish minutes. It's going to cover a bit of how we work and also some of the more recent work that we've done. And then obviously you can open up for some different questions. So I was asked to talk about what we do in terms of my day-to-day job as a corporate court jester, as I refer to myself, or sort of a corporate futurist, and also some of the more recent work that I've done with young people. So first, just to sort of summarize everything in my way of looking at the world and the work that we do, is that if you want to change the world, you have to understand the world. And that's really what futurism or foresight or whatever you want to call it is about. We can make up other sorts of definitions that make ourselves look good or feel good. But ultimately, if you're interested in the future, it's because you're interested in some sort of vision of the future. You have some sort of stake in where we're headed, and you have some ideas, we all do, as to what a good future would look like or what a bad future would look like. And in order for us to get towards the future we do want and stay away from the future we don't want, and I use the royal we there, we can refer to ourselves as individuals there, always a community or a company or a country. If we want to change that world, to get the world we want ahead, we have to be very, very realistic about understanding the world as it is. And that means noticing everything and looking at the ugly parts, looking at the parts that make us feel uncomfortable, because if we don't understand how things work, our tinkering with things is unlikely to get us what we want. So none of us can have perfect understanding, but I certainly see the primary part of my work is figuring out what it is that we're dealing with. What is the mess that we have right now? And then obviously understanding the constraints of what we can do to change it, what we can't do to change it. And then when it comes to looking at the world as it is, we can see things in the present and we can see things in the past. And then we have to make some sort of inferences about how those things could play out in the future. And there are essentially two lenses to look ahead at the future, if you want to oversimplify these things a lot. And the one would be the way the economist does it, and the other one would be the way the futurist does it. And I am academically trained in both these fields, so I've got a little bit of credibility, at least, to speak about it. And the economist way of looking at the future, as we mentioned just now, is to take past performance, data about what happened in the past, and then plot it out to predict what is going to happen next. We forecast. We plot a trend line and we infer that if things happen in the past, continue happening into the future, this is what the probable or likely future ahead for us is. Now, economists do this, political scientists do this, actuaries do this, insurance companies do this. It's all about taking past data, looking for the trend line, and essentially drawing that line into the future. But it is, ironically, an act of prediction. And as I mentioned just now, past performance is no guarantee of future returns. We have pandemics, we have wars that break out, we have surprises that happen every day. So we need another lens to look at the future, not just because our best laid plans can be derailed by unexpected reality, but also because that forecast, if we are looking at the future based on past performance, we're really limiting our view, much like this triangle shape on the screen shows you. It's about narrowing down to what we think our most probable future ahead is. And that's quite limiting because our expectations do shape our future reality very directly, not in a mystical way, but in a practical way. Because if we expect it's going to rain tomorrow, we're going to leave the house with an umbrella, or we might take a taxi instead of walking. If we expect that the economy is going to shrink next year, we might save a bit more and spend a bit less, and ironically actually kickstart that recession that we were so afraid of in the first place. So we have to be concerned about forecasts, not only because they are fallible, but also because they can change and manipulate our behavior and the way we act when it comes towards the future, which might not be in a direction that we actually want. So the other way of looking at the future is the diametric opposite, and that is to broaden our horizons away from the probable future that economists and politicians predict, and to go into the realm of speculation, to ask questions, to ask what if, to go beyond what is, the little point at the end of the triangle, towards the great realm of possibility ahead of us. What if? What if we are wrong with our forecasts? What can we do to change that? And that is the art of foresight. So rather than the science of prediction, the art of foresight actually isn't anything to do with prediction at all. It's about exploring the space. What could go wrong? What could go right? What do we want? What don't we want? It's about asking questions that are about curiosity rather than about zeroing in on a particular point. So it's a diametrically opposed way of looking at the future, but both lenses are useful. They're both models, and all models and maps are useful, but none of them are perfect. And that's why it's quite useful often to switch between those two lenses when you look ahead. But to illustrate this a bit more, I've got a few more diagrams that'll hopefully get this point across even easier for you. And that is to sort of speak about our work in both the trend and the future space. The trend work that I do is very much, as I mentioned, in the understanding the world space. Trends and signals are about seeing what's going on around us and figuring out what the mess is. So it's about noticing things. And signals are anything that catches your eye. It's anything that makes you go, ah, or makes you think, or makes you pause. Anything that makes you consider that there's some sort of something or change happening here. That's not a very scientific definition, but you kind of know it when you see it. If it makes you think, it's likely to make someone else think too. Now, that's the trend space, gathering those little signals together. And then we can use those two lenses to look ahead at the future. We can either try plot those little signals into a trend. As I say, that's about building a line to say, what is momentum? What is increasing across space and time? What has an incidence and what has a speed? That's basically what a trend is. So a trend is something that happens across time. It either builds or it breaks, and it happens in many places at the same time. That's when you know you've got a direction that you're pointing towards. But signals don't always point towards trends, and nor should they always. Signals can also be put together more like a puzzle than like a line into stories. And that's the way of looking at it through the lens of the futurist or through foresight, taking signals and creating new stories or new creative connections. And then, of course, we can go one step further and we can take those trends and those stories into the future space. So from the present into the future. And again, we can extrapolate them in really two different ways. The first way would be to create scenarios, which is the more sort of social sciencey way of looking at foresight and futures, where you take two trends, two directions, one that goes up and one that goes across, for example, and you plot it into a 2x2 matrix. The likes of the McKinseys and Accentures of the world love to do this. And you will then say, if this is more, if this trend continues up or bends down, and the other trend continues left and then goes right, what are the various futures we can have? So I'm really oversimplifying here the art and science of scenario planning. But scenario planning in its traditional format is very much a continuation of trends. It's about more, less, better, worse, quite still working within rigid lines. The other way, of course, is again to wear your more foresight futuristic hat and extrapolate the stories, the puzzle pieces, the connections you see around pieces of data into more speculative, more world building, more blank slate kind of thinking stories that can drive the future forward. And here you're not constrained with the likes of a 2x2 matrix or a catastrophic versus transformative kind of scenario mindset. Here we can talk about the future from the future's perspective and backcast back to the present if we want to get into a bit more sort of technical terminology. I'm not going to do that today. Instead, I'm going to actually show you how this works with some signals, because this is still very theoretical, and foresight and future should be quite practical. It's about changing the world, as I said. So let's take an example of both, the route of seeing like an economist into the future and that of seeing like a futurist into the future. So to that end, I've pulled together some signals that we've been talking about quite a lot across all of our work. Many of you will recognize this. Cost of living has gone up, things getting expensive, groceries are seen as luxury purchases, to the point that they're putting security tags onto blocks of cheese and blocks of butter. So never mind people being at risk of shoplifting things like designer shoes or handbags or watches or jewelry. People are now tempted to steal basic groceries because the cost of living has got so high. Another signal from another part of the world, this one coming from China. It's a signal that points towards a trend I've termed uncovered polls. This also points to economic desperation. And here the signal I looked at was some new generation digital loan sharks in China who are going to young people, particularly young female students, and offering them credit or personal loans in exchange for some rather risque collateral. In this case, the collateral they ask for is a naked selfie containing that person's identity card, as you can kind of see in the blurred image here. And if the young lady does not pay back the money, instead of repossessing her car, which she doesn't have, or her house, which again, she clearly doesn't have, they instead post her naked picture onto a pornographic website and recoup their costs through licensing her image in such a way. Again, this speaks to economic precarity and desperation. And another signal from another part of the world, from America, where we've started seeing these signs popping up in church and in grocery store parking lots, offering safe parking spaces for people who are living in their cars. And the sorts of people who are living in their cars in these sorts of places are not destitute drug addicts or people at the fringes of society. Many of these people have full-time jobs in nursing or in teaching. Again, speaking to an economic system that is getting a bit precarious at the corners. So those three signals, to use my little train mapping system here, uncovered calls, cheese tags, and teachers sleeping rough, point towards very clearly a trend of economic precarity and desperation. Cost of living is getting higher. That's a directional trend. People are getting further into debt. That's a directional trend. And then, of course, we can map it out. So an illustration there of a directional trend. This is from my market in South Africa, although I'm sure you have very similar charts where you are. This shows very literally the cost of living over the last 10 years. And in my country, the middle classes, middle income earners, are 40% poorer in real terms since 2006. That's not even 10 years to date. That's how much more expensive life has got from an average basket of goods. Very clear directional trend there. And you can map that into a set of scenarios too. The other sort of more subtle trend, it's also directional, that came through from the signals that I pulled through there, was this point that governments aren't necessarily supporting people who are falling through economic cracks. And in fact, it is the likes of grocery stores and churches who are stepping in to support people who are not able to find their way in the formal economy. So we could map those two trends, public or private aid, or more or less inequality, or a higher cost of living, onto a scenario matrix and come up with 4 different scenarios for the future based on those same trend directions that we've seen. I'm not going to do this now, but if you're interested in scenario planning, that's very much how it works, oversimplified. They usually do that exercise over a course of months, not over a course of sort of 3 or 4 minutes like I've done now. But that's essentially the signals to trends to scenarios, the economist way of looking at the future. But I've got another set of signals that we can map together in a more futuristic, foresight-orientated way. And here, the one that I picked up, it's not a new signal, but I still think it's profound, especially this image, and especially given the advances in AI and virtual reality over the last couple of years, is the concept of reality privilege. And that's the idea that you can have a much nicer life in virtual reality compared to your real life, like this poor gentleman here, who's very clearly sleeping rough and doesn't have a great quality of life in the real world, yet he's still able to don a virtual reality headset and perhaps dream that he is a king or a prince, or that his belly is full based on the virtual reality content that he's got ahead of him. And the concept virtual or reality privilege speaks to this idea that if we're not able to serve people's needs in the real world, it might be cheaper just to let them pretend that their needs are met in the virtual world. Quite a shocking, very let them eat cake idea. Came from Mark Andreessen, the very well-known, of course, investor, but it's certainly profound when you see this in action. The next signal, this is a gentleman called Brett. He is a good friend of mine. He's based in Cape Town, South Africa, and he works with a company called New Form Foods. He's one of the several entrepreneurs all across the world who are busy investing in the lab-grown meat industry, having essentially a future where we can both have our cow and eat it too. So meat for vegetarians is basically his mission, but it's a growing sector and something that we're seeing more and more investment in. A signal worth paying attention to. And the last signal I've got in this little set here is that of de-extinction. And this is how scientists figure that they're pretty close to being able to, say, rematerialize various creatures and animals that we have caused to go extinct. The one being the mammoth, for example, but we could also get dodos growing again, perhaps one day. Whether we want to do that or not is, of course, a question for us to speculate as futurists. But to illustrate this point of these signals don't have to point to a particular trend, but they could make a picture that we can able to create a new story about where the future is at. And combining these together, that of reality privilege, that of lab-grown meat, and that of de-extinction or using cell samples to create new living entities, gives us a new story that could be framed as something like eat the rich. This is a phrase many of you would have heard, but now we can make it literally by combining gross inequality that we see in the world, very insensitive statements from global billionaires, with new advances in cellular technology. We can very literally get to a point, and this is a real example of someone who's taken disparate signals and created a story that makes that future more tangible. And this is a company that put this it's an artistic project. It's not a commercial product, but it is all absolutely doable through current technology. They were suggesting we could very literally eat the rich by taking a skin sample of, say, one of the greatest celebrities of the time, maybe Taylor Swift, for example, taking a skin sample of Taylor Swift's hair, using it to grow salami, so you can very literally eat the rich. So quite an interesting example of how you can take signals and create a new story that tell a very different future for us. And of course, you can take that even further. Instead of creating matrix-based, very linear scenarios, we can world build from these ideas and come up with books and with novels that can illustrate a future that we may or may not want to live in. And some of the worlds that seem that they could be part of these stories that I've put together here are the likes of Snow Crash or even Jurassic Park, in that we can resurrect animals. And do we want to do that? So that will hopefully give you an indication of how a futurist can speculate about the future based on signals that we found in the present and putting them together in new and interesting ways. But to bring it back a little bit more practically, before I hand over back to Tim, I also wanted to, I was asked to speak a bit about some of my youth research and about how we go about looking at those signals in the real world and then speculating about the future too, to catalyze action so we can change the world in the direction that we want it to. Now, what's on the screen here is a big report that I put together in the first quarter of this year. We worked with a research agency based in South Africa. Yes, the insights are South African specific, but I think they do have global relevance. If you're interested in the report, it's massive. It's over 200 pages long. The QR code's there. It's free to download. But I'm going to pull out a couple of key insights and also how we got to them. In that, if we are starting to look for signals, whether we want to plot trends or whether we want to come up with new stories, we have to look across both space and across time. When we look across time, it means if we want to contextualize ourselves into the direction that we're heading, we do need to look at the past to see what hasn't changed and what has changed. We also need to look at the present, and that means listening to people, whether that be online or offline, and seeing what's going on around us in the here and now. We can't live in the past. We need to look at the present, but we also need to consider the future. What are artists? What are writers? What are movie makers? What are children talking and writing and drawing about? Because those are the ideas that are going to guide us forward. And we also, as I said, need to look across space for signals. We need to go to different places. We need to travel, either virtually or in real life. We need to walk around our neighborhoods. Alain de Botton has a great book about the art of travel. And one of the chapters in the book is about traveling around his bedroom and noticing things in his room that he never would have otherwise, and actually treating that exploration of his bedroom space as a trip in and of itself, as a holiday in and of itself. So think about spaces, but that doesn't mean necessarily spending lots of money and getting on a plane and going somewhere, but it does mean considering the actual physical space that we live in, looking for what's going on there. And then, of course, also in terms of across space, we need to actually connect with other people. We need to go to conferences. We need to have, as we said, conversations. So the methodology for this report, because we were looking at young people, we wanted to talk to young people and actually hear and converse with them, because we shouldn't do anything for people without actually talking to the subject of our discussion, right? We shouldn't only do desktop research. We have to actually get out there and speak to people. This was a very personal ethnographic study, but it validates it and backed up a lot of the more sort of trend-based research we have done as to what's going on with young people at the moment. And since you are young people, of course, I'm very interested to see if these insights actually resonate with your part of the world too. But when it came to young people, and we were looking at the target market of 18 to 30-year-olds in South Africa specifically, we figured out there was basically 3 trends going on, overarching themes that emerge from our research that, again, I'm very interested to see if you see the same things where you are. And these trends or these insights and these macro themes contrast with each other, and yet at the same time, they tell a more complex story as to what's going on with young people. The first theme that we came out was this idea of apathy, this idea of not being super interested in a career or in politics, which is one of the key themes of our research, this idea of youth voter apathy, but also young people not wanting to support corporate causes. Again, if you look at some of those other signals I showed you around nonsense economics and growing inequality and having a full-time job, but still not being able to afford a house, this does tend to make sense. And this is something that came strongly through the conversations we had, but it's also backed up with things like the Tangping movement in China and other parts of the world where youth voter apathy is trending upwards. The next one is that of anarchy. And I'm going to show you a video that came from, again, our youth cohort in South Africa.
Is there audio on this? Is there supposed to be?
Hello, I'm here.
Okay.
So that I showed you there was a video clip of the so-called Latwizi movement based in South Africa, which is an entirely anarchist youth movement, a really important signal, certainly from my perspective. This is a protest without a cause. This is young people who organize on social media, show up at malls and places of business, all dressed in generally blackish looking clothes. That's the general theme, although you can't see it too clearly here, and cause chaos, just scare old people, and particularly mothers with children, for no reason, for no purpose, other than that they can. So this kind of sense of pent up energy doesn't have anywhere directed to flow to, particularly in a society like ours, has a very high unemployment rate, is this undercurrent of chaos and nihilism that we've definitely seen across our youth research. But the picture doesn't stop there. The third theme that we came up with was that of activists. Now, young people at this age group, the 18 to 30-year-olds, certainly have caused much greater impact in society than 18 to 30-year-olds that when I was in the 18 to 30-year-old cohort. Whether you're looking at politics, whether you're looking at sustainable commerce and governance, whether you're looking at music, arts, and culture, young people galvanizing for political and social causes through whatever sort of resources they have, be that economic, be that fame, be that politics, again, is another thread that we certainly saw. So a very high social justice barometer came out. And from this research paper where we saw the sort of three-headed monster of apathy, anarchy, and activism, and try to figure out which of those themes is going to win through with this generation in the future, it comes down really to how much space older generations give younger generations to impact upon the world. And that's basically what we looked at when we put together all of our different signals. We use this web that looks at technology, retail, economics, nature, diplomacy, and sociocultural trends. And we use that to gather the signals that sort of shaped these 3 themes that came out. But from those 3 themes, we then put on our futurist or world-building hats and put together sort of 3 different speculative newspapers, not that they're going to be newspapers, but news websites, if you want to put it that way, or whatever it is, news flashes, news cards from 20 years in the future, looking at what happens if apathy, anarchy, or activism win out into the future. I'm not going to share this with you now, but we also used AI to put together sort of mini movies of each of these to really illustrate and bring to life the speculative futures that could come out if those three different threads are fed or are not fed going forward. And that sort of picture of a future that you might or might not want to live in are the sorts of pictures and stories that drive action, that get people to go from what is to what if. And that's just for basically what I prepared for you today. I talk about, as I said, from signals to stories in various different ways, and some of the more sort of practical ways we have implemented this in our work. If you're interested in going through these newspapers and the scenarios that I mentioned, the videos, they're all there on that same QR code page that I put up. I can get that for you again. If I go back here, we can, if you're interested in going and seeing that in your own time, but I'm not going to belabor that point right now. We can rather get on with the discussion.
Awesome. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
I don't know, the sharing stopped there for a second.
Okay. That was an incredible intro to strategic foresight, and putting it into the context of narratives. One of the narratives that I see in your research there that I'd love to hear you speak a bit more about is this fracturing that's happening where we start asking, what do governments do? What do cities do? What does education do? There's a theme throughout all of these kind of what are sort of these institutions that we used to trust. And we, say if you go to university, you get a degree, you get a job. If, we sort of have some faith in the fact that cities are planned in a certain way or whatever, but all of this has now become kind of a micro, it's turned into this sort of inward micro, and we're looking for other kinds of connections. What's your thought on that kind of theme? But then also, what do you see as like, what do governments do in the future? Because in a way, I think there might be a crisis in understanding what they do. We're going through that process right now in the US, and I think globally, many different kinds of populist movements are really tied to this issue of what's government good for anyway? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think maybe to answer the first part of your question, if I've understood it correctly, is that there definitely is this sort of sense that for many of us and more of us, we kind of on the outside looking in, like the almost power and privilege have crystallized around a certain class, and it's becoming harder and harder to push through. And as such, it doesn't make sense to try to incorporate yourself within an environment that has no space for you, that's not prepared to make space for you. I think that we feel this a lot stronger, particularly among younger generations, for the very simple reason that people are living longer. And that means that people stay in positions of power really longer than they should. I mean, like you're in America, Joe Biden stepped down now, but did he step down as early as he perhaps could have or should have to give space to younger people within his party, right? You had to wait a lot longer for that space in politics. You have to wait a lot longer for that space in companies to get promoted. You have to wait for people to retire in order to get their job. But if they're retiring 20 years later, you have to work so long. Is it worth it? And the same thing is happening, of course, to more nuclear level, where you have whole generations of people accusing older generations of wealth hoarding, of not handing that wealth over to their children or to their grandchildren. But people are simply just living longer, which means that power sharing becomes that much more difficult. And as many of you, again, would know, if you have done a lot of reading and understand your science fiction and mythology and fantasy and all the rest of it, we know that vampires tend to be quite rich, right? Because they've kind of stuck around for long, and they're not likely to want to hand over power and privilege to other generations which they've accumulated, we kind of want to hang on to. So there's a sense of insiders and outsiders, and it's a generational conflict, it's an international conflict. And it's certainly a sense of if you can't beat them, there are various ways you can respond to that. And you can respond to that kind of with those three themes I've put together there. Through opting out, through giving up, through anarchy and nihilism, or instead of investing in the stock market, speculating on sports betting, if you want a more economic sort of example there, or you can challenge it through activism and try to actually change the system. So those are kind of the three broad options that we've seen, which kind of inform what's going on there. But I think it makes a lot of sense that a system that doesn't work for people is going to be challenged by a different generation in different sorts of ways, which kind of brings us to the second part of your question, which is, where do governments fit in? And again, governments are being looked at by present and future generations, if you want to put it that way, as what are you actually doing to serve me? At the moment, you're serving an older cohort. The social security systems that are designed to protect the old are protecting the old at what expense of the young? So going forward, governments are going to have to reinvent themselves. Like, we've become used to governments as being essentially service providers for us. We have forgotten the roots of democracy, and that democracy is supposed to be governance by the governed for the governed. It's supposed to be an active, citizen-led initiative, and instead we've become clients of our states. And at the same time, states have essentially lost their ability to deliver those services that previous generations or older current generations have become accustomed to, simply because sooner or later, if you're not making more people, you're going to run out of money, which is kind of where we're getting. For every one young person, there's going to be how many older people who are dependent upon them. Signals there are the likes of Japan at the moment is busy converting their kindergartens into care facilities for the old, just to sort of show a real shift in terms of where the demand is for space and for training and for education and for care. Massive shifts. And that really is going to get us to rethink about our role with government. I think there's some positive signals there. There are a whole lot of active citizenship movements going on at the moment, which is talking about reclaiming participation for civil society rather than leaving everything up to sort of very sclerotic, very sort of permafrosty governments that have become big and bloated, but at the same time are delivering less and less for their citizens. And I think that living in a country like South Africa, where our government has failed faster simply because there's been more dependence and less money, we've had to see more partnerships between civil society and with government. And that is going to be a challenge for future generations to get their heads around, if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I just wanted to, because you're coming from an economics background too, and sort of thinking in terms of how did we get here? If you look at the history of, if I just look at US history, what we have as sort of US global dominance has a lot to do with Keynesian economics after World War II, and a lot of that kind of investment that government made, and the trust in government really through the Depression and after World War II. But what's happened is that we went through that cycle, and then we went into this privatization, sort of rise of very particular kind of US libertarianism that has sort of like, the answer is always coming from, the tech sector or business. But now we sort of have issues. I mean, we've gone through that, all of those, the Facebooks and whatever had the answer to what our future was. But now we're going, wait a minute, it might be boiling our children, all of these things that we had such faith in. But the problem is that then they go to government and they go, well, give us regulation. And neither of these two have any answers. So it's back to us. So are we in this, like, that's that question where it seems like the theme is that so much is on the individual now. And we have to kind of network, is that how do, part of it is like help. Obviously the individual has a voice and they're saying something's wrong, but only change can happen if you begin to create some sort of a collective narrative of this, or else it's sort of Blade Runner or some sort of like, sort of weird science fiction dystopia. So like, you're an economist, like, how do we get out of that kind of hyper individualism that I think that we've been forced into?
Yeah, so I think there's great parallels between governments and technology, in that particularly in democracies, governments and technologies give us what we think that we want. We very much do get the government that we vote for in a very literal sense. It might not be what everybody wants at any given point in time, but in general, what most citizens want from the government is less taxes and more economic growth and more comfortable lives for themselves and for their children. And there's nothing wrong with wanting that. That's what most people want, a more prosperous tomorrow compared to today. They want your children to have more than what you had. You want to be able to live in a bigger house as you get older, not necessarily a small one. Maybe you don't want that exact thing, but you want some sort of progress. Technology, very, very similar. We want more efficiency. We want lower cost. We want more things for less money. And we want more things for less effort. And that's what technology gives us, because that's what we think we want on a very sort of superficial level. But I was having this conversation with Andrew McLuhan, who is the sort of the inheritor of the McLuhan media sort of criticism empire. He calls it a family business. Of course, Marshall McLuhan, very well known in terms of criticizing media, and the media is the message and all this sort of thing. And we had a very similar conversation, but around technology, not around governance, and around how by getting what we think we want, we're losing a whole lot of things that we deeply need and that we actually desire at a more subliminal level that we have less ability to articulate. And here's where it gets very interesting with economics too, in that economics is often criticized for measuring the wrong things, as it rightly should. We measure GDP and we consider it a proxy for growth. But GDP is a number that's been made up, a flattened, squashed metric that we now follow. And it's not necessarily encompassing what actual growth is and what we actually want when we say we want to grow. When we want to grow, we want to flourish. We don't actually want to live on a barren, decimated planet. Rather, we want a degree of increased progress and increased comfort and increased quality of life. That's what you really want with economic growth. You don't just want more money in your bank account. That's a means towards a more comfortable life. Maybe you get to spend more time in nature, right? So we're quite bad at articulating and very bad at voting for the things that we want. We vote for, whether it's with our time, our attention, or our governments, the things that we think we want, those superficial things, not for the bigger picture, which is why we kind of have to interrogate ourselves. We have to actually figure out what it is that we actually want, because the magic thing about being human and about living in this time where we've got 8 billion people to help us do it is that we actually do get what we say we want and what we vote for. We've had a lot of progress. We've got the things that we want. If we want swimming pools, we get swimming pools. Where that's a good thing to have or not, we still get it. You know, if we want to go put a man on the moon, we can put a man on the moon. Whether that's really what we want or what we should be progressing or putting our resources toward is entirely up for debate. But I think that what we're missing in our democracies and in our personal lives when it comes to our relationship with the technologies of democracy and the technologies of computers and AI is actually figuring out what it is that we want before we get it. Because once we get it, it's very hard to sort of put that back. And is that necessarily fair? Not necessarily. But I think it is an individual thing, because as much as we want to blame petro companies or blame politicians and individuals, they're very much the tip of an iceberg of our collective demand for these things. So if you're being sold something that's not good for you, it's very difficult to push back and say you don't want it, because it's tempting. It's satisfying the needs that you have right now, or at least the desires that you have right now. But we need to take those steps back. We're constantly being sold ideas, policies, toys, technologies, products, services that we don't necessarily need and that might not actually be what we want in the long run, but they're very attractive in the short run. And that's why we have to develop as individuals and as communities, as we sort of say in this future space, empathy with our future selves. And that's why telling stories about the future we're going to have, if we continue on with what we're doing now, or if we don't, are so powerful, because those stories are what's going to guide us forward. And I think that's what we're severely lacking at the moment, because we talk about like criticizing and railing against the machine and the system and all this. Yeah, it's all work that has to be done. But unless we're coming up with new stories that articulate what it is we really want, not just what we want in the now, but what we want for our future selves, for our future descendants, if we're going to have them, for posterity. Unless we articulate those visions really, really well, we're kind of stuck in this present cycle where our technologists, our big businesses, the big petro companies, the governments are giving us what we want right now, which appears to be, based on our behavior, more cheap clothes from Shein and Temu. You know, as long as we keep buying them, that's what we're going to get. But we're buying them to sort of satisfy a present need because we're not thinking about the bigger picture. And we don't have a galvanizing picture as to what it is that we really want going forward. So again, I don't think I'm really answering your question, but I think we perhaps need less protests, and we need more pictures and stories as to what it is we really, really want. And that requires art, because at the moment, when we think about what we want, we say GDP growth up 5%, economic unemployment down 5%, which are very flat numbers and don't tell a real story. Oh, what's happening?
Something happened?
Oh, Microsoft Teams is taking over my computer. I will stop it. It's doing an update. I don't know what it's doing.
See?
Microsoft Teams is the real virus.
There you go. I wanted to follow up on that because, and I want to hand it over to questions from the class. I hope students, that if you think of contextualizing this into your own kinds of what's going, things that are going on in your own perspectives. But the other, I'm introducing the students to Steven Pinker's work this afternoon, and this tension between rationality and irrationality. The part of the issue, especially now, is that it's very hard. It's very hard for people to have a longer term view, and I would say through the pandemic, we've become much more nearer term. A lot of the sort of the we premiumized and sort of luxurified all of this kind of longer term sustainability and all these kind of things. And then the pandemic comes and basically people are like, fuck that shit. I want what I can get now. And if you can give me more of my near term future, I'll be really happy with that. Part of that is understandable, but at the same time, we can cook ourselves in that particular way if we stay within the near term. So do you see that there's some need to be able to encourage society to become longer term thinkers without sort of turning that into what I think we've done with ESG and all these other kinds of initiatives into this sort of luxury premiumized for the people who have the ability, the time to think about those things. The average people struggling with inflation and all that, how do they think longer term?
Yeah, I almost think that that's actually the role that governments need to take. I mean, the governments, we've become dependent on governments to give us what we want, whereas actually the role of a government in a functional society is to stop us from having what we don't need. Like the first role of government is law and order. And we think of law and order just in terms of safety and security, not being shot in the street, like organizing norms around violence and, like just keeping basic order. But it's more than that. It's also about putting limits on society where we are not able to sort of, help ourselves. And the first things that we sort of ask governments to do, they are put limits on companies, for example, where that be rules against pollution or rules against corruption and fraud and price gouging or whatever you might want to put there. But we also need sort of rules against excess for ourselves, not regulation per se, but rather limits as to what our collective wants should actually give us. And I think there's an interesting example there. It came from one of the European countries where the government said the citizens are never going to vote for in democracy like sustainability policy. They're never going to vote for less airplanes or for slower cars. But at the same time, what people actually want, when you ask them what they want and what their great desires are, it is for a cleaner, greener planet for themselves and for their children. They don't want to be sick from air pollution. They don't want to die of tuberculosis 10 years earlier than they should because there's coal plants in their backyard. But if you ask people to vote over short-term policy, you actually get people voting against their deeper interests because they're voting to survive. They're voting for as you said, like against the eggflation. They're voting to be able to afford housing and food. And that's not a problem. That's a natural way that people are going to behave. So it almost seems that what we need from our governments is kind of limits to democracy. We kind of need more constitutional ways of thinking about the future. And there's many futurists that are busy doing this at the moment. So sort of manifestos that say what the constitution should be, not necessarily regulations over specific technologies or specific companies, but rather ways of thinking about value systems and encoding that and holding our laws and our innovations and our patents and all the rest of it up to the values of our constitutions. And another thing with constitutions is that every generation really should be rewriting their own there, right? Because a constitution is supposed to reflect your values. And again, I think the South African constitution is quite interesting there because it's not very quantitative at all. It's very qualitative. It holds up values like dignity and like respect as key constitutional values, which are not quantitative. They're not easily flattenable into economic lines or into economic indicators. Rather, they ask us to evaluate every decision as to whether that lives up to the idea of dignity and respect for each other. And those are the sorts of questions that perhaps we should be putting towards our politicians, which we never hear about. We hear about economic terms, we hear about migration policies, we hear about sort of simple big problems rather than nuanced things, which are actually going to guide us towards one future or another, if that makes sense. And I think that's possibly a way that we can redesign government for the future, as in a protocol rather than a rule and regulation kind of basis.
Yeah, you've touched upon kind of a very hot issue in the American political space, because in the right now within the US, if you're a, kind of what is the new version of a Republican in the US, there's a lot of talk about us not being a democracy and being, being constitutional republic. And I agree with you in terms of that is the only way to get things done. The problem is within the US right now, there's a fight. Those that are fighting for that constitution are saying women should never have been given the right to vote. And like, there's a whole other kinds of issues. How they want to rewrite that constitution is interpret the constitution is terrifying to very many people in the US right now. So we're going through, it's the great Ben Franklin quote. It's a republic if you could keep it. Like, it's sort of the idea of being able to keep our own sense of participation in our political society. We're at a moment where those terms are getting kind of fuzzy. And there are people, and the right is in the US is much better, I think, at understanding how to harness that language. We've assumed on the left to be, things will, they sort of gradually, people will vote for the right things. They'll vote for the things that are good, because that's what it was for 50, 60 years, because things improved. Now, that issue of shifting towards constitution and being able, no matter how many people say they would vote against a woman's right to choose, for example, would suddenly become, but it's a constitutional issue. And that's exactly
the point I'm getting at. The Constitution shouldn't be a rule book. It should be a code of values, a code of conduct instead. So take something like women's rights. The very fact that it can be legislated yes or no and turned into a binary answer is a complete failure. Instead, if the value was human kindness, you've got a very different set of answers, right? Suddenly you understand you're dealing with much more nuanced circumstances. You're dealing with personal choice. You're dealing with dignity and with respect and with human autonomy. You're not dealing with yes, this is something the Constitution approves or not. It shouldn't even be a constitutional issue, in my perspective. It's like, you got to remove that from it's got nothing to do with the government. It's got nothing to do with the government. Can't legalize this or illegalize this. The values.
Human rights versus civil rights. I mean, we're at a point where I think that you're touching upon, and it's interesting because, and this is the kind of conversations that we have offline, is that so much relies upon language, and it relies upon how language forms these stories, because how you're going to get a future has a lot to do with how we have a shared perception of what kind of narratives we need. The problem is that currently there's a lot of ways of twisting, to use McLuhan, to kind of tribalize the use of language, right? And that, it's complicated, but there's a positive future if we can become aware of these kinds of things.
And I think it's almost a question that we actually need to, before we worry about politicians who are always going to be there and always going to be the worst men and women among us that volunteer themselves for such roles. I mean, it's a very self-selecting breed, the whole sort of, popularity contest we've got going on there. I think we've almost got more work to do as a society in our role of our legal system, the judges and jurors that we have, right? Because the point of the legal system, actually, in the Western tradition, isn't to create rules. It's quite the opposite. It's to interpret them in terms of a set of values, right? And the law is so fluid, but it's basically our kind of last moral and value-based defense in a society that's entirely secularized, as it really should be. But, you know, the law shouldn't be a blunt instrument so much as it should be a softening factor when it comes to the very hard laws that, you know, the guys that execute the stuff get to put out, which is, I think, something that's been troubling me at the moment. If you look at the South African legal history, again, our country has got great examples that can sort of depoliticize your conversations. You can just use us as an example. The law has been used to both uphold values and also to absolutely destroy them. And that just shows how flexible it is and how personal the law really is, and how every law can be interpreted and should be interpreted according to the values that we want to uphold. And it's sort of who we want to be rather than what we want to permit or not permit. And I think we make mistakes in society and in technology when it comes to, and in economics and all the rest of it, by trying to reduce really wicked, complex human problems to this should always be allowed or this should always not be allowed. Like to break it down into rules is to oversimplify the unsimplifiable. It's always a choice. There's always nuance. And again, the sort of parallels with technology is so beautiful there, because technology is binary. It is developed in bits and bytes and ones and zeros. It is flattened. It will never have the full perspective. I think when you start to combine a feature of technology with a feature of law and order and governance, that's when we perhaps really going to get ourselves into frightening constructs, when the gray and when the vagaries sort of become solidified into laws, into code. I think that's the great challenge of our age, is to push back against that, and to understand that problems are constantly evolving and there's no definitive answer to really anything when it comes to the social sciences. It's quite different to the sort of laws of gravity and actual science. Social science is all exceptions.
Yeah, you're bringing us back to what you started with, which is really, I mean, it's a lovely way to dovetail into questions from the class, is that what is the distinction between foresight and forecasting? And the issue is it closed? Because the idea of probability versus possibility, open system versus closed system, our interpretation of what you can interpret the law as a closed system. And that is what's going on here in the US a lot, is that our fear is that this idea of traditionalism or originalism and all of that, there's the idea of history being a closed thing or an open thing. I mean, history written by certain people, we've got all the information we need, everything about the past, we already know. We just kind of no, it's open. We constantly, all of these things, if you understand them as being open, you take a foresight approach rather than a forecasting approach. It's not linear, it's more open in that regard. But I think in some ways that we need to, this is I think an objective with many different organizations is we need to educate. And it goes back to, I think Pinker talks about this in terms of training people to be able to think more like this, because in a way, taking that, being more aware of what is going well, understanding how to read these signals, all of the things that you're talking about, and thinking in those narratives, but saying oh, I could make a better decision that's not just about going to work against my long-term interest, but actually think about, oh, I'll have a life. And I know that certain things I do now are investing in other things that are going to happen in the future. It's an interesting moment. It ties very well into what you were talking about earlier. I want to be sure to hand over can we get some questions from the class? Anybody want to ask any questions or just comments or anything? You can kind of come up, please. Somebody? Anybody? It's early on a Monday, so anybody have any questions at all or comments?
I don't have any questions. I just want to make a compliment for the lecture, the slides. It was really good. She explained really well.
You can't hear, but you just got a great compliment. Your slides were very, very informative. We're going through our Monday morning sort of wind up, sort of getting warmed up for the week. This has been, you really did frame it so perfectly, and I'm really going to encourage the students to download that report, because it's those narratives that you were sharing are going to be really useful. They're working on some futures kind of foresight project work this week, and it's a lovely foundation. I had started with that question about what's the difference between forecasting and foresight, and I couldn't think of a better sort of outline of that. So it was really, really, it was really incredible. Anything else that you want to leave us with, Bronwyn?
Oh no, just if you're interested in the report was the research study. I shared you like the little seeds of the little scenarios in terms of those newspaper clips. I'll send you the deck afterwards if you want to read through it. But we are compiling the scenario report that goes along with that, with the video AV sort of scenarios that go along with that. That's going to be dropping next week. So if you want a link to that, that's going to be a much quicker read. It's only going to have the signals that are relevant to the scenarios and the scenarios there. So you can kind of follow along and see how we pulled those sort of speculations together and how we turned them into stories that make them quite human and emotive. It is very South African, but you know, a lot of the issues are relevant to the rest of the world, and that'll also be freely available on our website next week. So I can definitely drop you a copy if you're interested. That will certainly save you time wading through the 200 pages of primary research. Yeah.
It's what foresight people do. They write long reports and then they try and put them into little snackier bites or whatever. I love, I have to say, I mean, it's just really always a pleasure because your approach, it's hard, and I've been teaching this this course in trend analysis for going on 20 years now, and it was very hard to find people who were taking this social science kind of serious approach. It's where people are connecting more, I think, in terms of this topic. How you go about this work is just really remarkable, and it's just great to have it be part of our class, and I hope to be able to connect with you again for a trend class. You know, we could talk more about some of these amazing things. You really laid out some wonderful themes for us today. Thank you so much.
And if I can just leave one final point, just to sort of recap everything we said here, and that is, economists know, politicians know, our expectations shape our reality, and our expectations are shaped through stories. And the most emotive stories involve words and pictures. That involves the creative industry. And these stories can be hijacked to create, as Monica Bazilka, another futurist, says, you know, to create like dystopia as a profit playbook. All those stories can be used to actually galvanize people towards an ideal and a vision that we actually want to have. So don't discount the creative arts in terms of the absolute power we have over the future. Both our good ideas and our bad ideas are sort of seeds that will be picked up with people who have the capital, both social and financial, to execute them. So drop good ideas into the universe and we'll get more of them.
The students were doing some culture mapping last week and introducing to the whole hero's journey and mapping some of those emergent to residual futures. And so this idea of the way you laid out narratives is a wonderful build on that going into this week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, be in touch, Bronwyn. Thank you again. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.